and to do our house.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. And just a quick housekeeping note before we begin this evening meeting. First, just for a quick sound check, I just want to make sure that those joining us via Zoom can hear. So if you could raise your hands to acknowledge that, we will then lower your hand to give you a chance to raise them again to participate in public comments. Okay, great. So it sounds like we can actually hear us. That's fantastic. So for members of the public who are joining the meeting via computer, device, or phone, please be advised that your microphone, webcam, and phone are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during public comment portion of the meeting and haven't already done so, you can now please raise your virtual hands and join the speakers queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the blue hand icon. And for those listening to the meeting on the phone, press *9. We will lower hands as speakers are called upon. When the public comment begins, we will announce your name and unmute your microphone. You will have 2 minutes to speak, after which your microphone will again be muted. Regarding the chat and QA functionality of Zoom, please note that attendees will not be able to use these features. Lastly, in accordance with the passage of HB 4212, this meeting will be recorded. Recordings will be posted on the Sustainability Commission websites. I want to again thank everyone for their continued patience, flexibility, and good humor as we continue to find ways to meet safely and hear from members of the community. As always, you can contact the Sustainability Commission if there is testimony you were not able to provide or wish to get it to us in a different format. And with that, I turn the meeting over to Chair.
Thanks, Ian. So our first item is reviewing and approving the agenda.
Second.
All in favor? If you approve the agenda. Any stand aside or opposed? Great. So I want to do for our land acknowledgement today. I want to share 2 groups that you might be interested in supporting. The first one is the NDN, those are the letters NDN Collective, and that's a national group that does land back, as well as lots of other Indigenous rights and environmental rights work. The other one is the Indigenous Environmental Network, and they do a lot of work on just transition, among many, many other things. And then a local effort I wanted to share is the travel guide series. There is now an Oregon Indian country travel guide. Anybody seen that? Oh, you've seen it. It's really cool. It has lots of information about the different tribes in Oregon, cultural history, events, etiquette, how to be respectful, and list of museums and things you can visit and learn about. And I just already sent the links to Ian, so they'll go in our notes in a written format soon. And before we go on, the last part of the opening is we have a new commissioner. And she's going to introduce herself really briefly, and then if we could just do like a really quick go around, say your name, one thing about you, anything you want her to know in 30 seconds or less.
Wow.
Okay. Or you can be a little
I'll try. I'm Devin Mann. I'm a Eugene native, and I was away for about 25 years in Northern Illinois and came back and just at the very, very beginning of the pandemic. And so I've been doing that. I'm a co-chair for Southeast Neighbors Association Board. And I'm very concerned about environmental issues as they affect our neighborhood, as well as the entire city of Eugene. I'm a biologist and a teacher and a researcher who's unemployed. So I have a lot of time to volunteer. That's a dangerous thing to say. So send me an email. I'll give you my new email. If you have any questions, comments about anything, or talk to me after the meeting or something like that, if you like. But thanks.
welcome.
Chris Shorgus, and we have a 3-year-old husky who learns to talk more every day.
I'm Dennis Reynolds. I'm a mostly retired Unitarian Universalist minister. I'm considered a community minister in the local congregation, and returned to Eugene myself after a 10-year late in life career in ministry. Previous to that, I administered student childcare services at the University of Oregon for 30+ years.
I'm Emily Semple, Eugene City Councilor, Ward 1 and Sustainability Commission Liaison. And I have been on this commission longer than any of you. So I'm obviously happy about it. And I have 2.5 weeks ago, a 7-month-old Doberman lab. Like I wasn't busy already.
Art Farley, retired University of Oregon professor of computer science for 40 years and been on the commission for 8 years.
I think we might be almost.
I think so.
No, I think
I'm
you
old.
win.
I
think you
was
win.
gonna raise the issue. This will probably be my
I
last,
poll.
be my last year, unless I can get elected, but I'm not running.
I'll make a note, not a vote.
I'm Jan Bowman. It's my second year on the commission. I live in Southeast Neighbors and retired city of Eugene employee. Lived in Eugene for about 40 years now. And let's see, we have an elderly dog that's returning to puppy stage. Pooped in the house twice this morning.
My name is Mitra Gruwell, and I'm an upcycle fashion designer and educator, and a board member of the Arts and Business Alliance of Eugene, a master recycler. I have no dogs, but 4 kids really. My daughter turns 21 tomorrow, so I'm excited about that. You can go see shows with me.
I'm Hannah Schaefer. I work for Lynn County in emergency management doing natural hazard mitigation work. And I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I just moved here, started the pandemic as well. And I don't have any dogs or kids, but I do have a childhood dog that I was given for my birthday. But she's scared of everything, so I couldn't take her with me across Oregon. My parents have her, so yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Ian Penn. I am the sustainability manager for the city of Eugene. I don't have any current pets. I grew up with a bunch of weird animals, but I won't go into that right now. So you did a skunk and a quail, and some other things, raccoon, but nothing right now.
Who's the helpful human in the corner?
Step over here. I'm not sure where I'll be seen. I'm Lacey Risdall. I am the Division Director for Public Works Administration. I work with Ian in the Sustainability Program. I have 2 kids, 2 dogs, and it seems like my kids always bring home more kids. So I have a lot in the house. Thanks.
Louise DeHare, this is my 4th year on the commission. And I have an 80-pound street dog who sleeps all day.
I'm Laura Allen, and I have two kids, 2 pet rats. 3, bunch of quail. My daughter has 3 quail. They're not.
I left my pets out.
Somebody started the pet.
Oh,
Pet
that's
thing was
Chris.
fun.
Yeah. Great. Well, welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have any pets?
I do. I have a very bad dog and an amazing cat. The dog tries to be her best self. That's all we can hope for.
So we're gonna move into public comment. So is there anybody we have? Yes, thank you all for coming. Does anyone want to give public? Anybody on the Zoom want to give? I'm not seeing any hands raising yet. Okay.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. I think that's it.
Oh, we have 1 hand raised. Would you like me to allow them to talk? Okay, got it.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I'm Ashwini. I'm really happy to be here, part of the meeting. I have been here just wanted to introduce myself. I've been here for 2.5 years. And I have a background in environmental science, but I'm just interested in seeing how we can further the city's sustainability goals. And I'm specifically interested in these gas-powered leaf blowers. So I'm just really here to see, hear about what all has been going on in the city and excited to talk more to y'all. Thanks.
Great, thanks for coming. Is there anybody else want to do public comment? Okay, so anyone have responses to public comment? Counselor Simpson.
Yeah, gas leaf blowers. They should go. I'm really need your help because when I bring it up to anybody in council, they kind of roll their eyes. We have so many more important things that people really are making a ruckus about. So I don't know, we could have a demonstration with our electric leaf blowers and like race. But anyway, I would love to have that happen. But I don't hold your breath.
Is the concern the carbon, the toxics, or the noise? All of them.
The fuel use, the toxins and the noise. I live where 4 days a week, there's a different leaf blower set. Thank you.
So we have a presentation. This is kind of the bulk of our meeting time tonight, and I think we are ready to start it. Unless I've missed anything. Oh, a minute. See, that wasn't on there. We approved the agenda, but we did not approve the minute.
That's true. Sorry.
That's okay. I forgot.
I'll move to do a minute.
I just have one question.
Is it about the minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's about, I didn't see it reflected in the minutes, and I had a recollection that maybe it was one additional meeting back where we had had a discussion about trying to get reports back on any responses and a summary of the recommendations the commissions made over time. Was that last time or was that a previous meeting? Because I reviewed minutes and I kind of expected to see it there. I don't know if others recall that we had a previous conversation to kind of hear back where things went.
I think that was the October meeting.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
in relation to our plan, right?
Yeah, I couldn't remember when it was. And so thank you. That was my question. When did we ask for that?
There's just one small typo or additional word on page 5 that may not be worth editing, but that was my only recommendation. Under the action item for drafting the letter for the overlay zone, there's just an additional word in the second sentence. Otherwise, I move to approve. Second.
So all in favor of fixing that typo? You read the, well, you weren't there. You should probably
I
stand
wasn't
aside.
there.
Yeah, usually if
I
you're
read
not here, you stand aside. Stand aside. And any. Great. So now we're moving on to our climate friendly equitable community parking standard reform presentation, question and answer, and then getting input from us. You guys want to introduce yourself? I
Yes.
don't have that.
I think Reed is planning to do that as part of
Oh,
the
okay.
presentation.
Got it, yeah.
Got it.
All right, just make sure we're all set up here. All right, good evening, Eugene Sustainability Commission. My name is Reed Bruner, and I'm the Land Use Supervisor with Building and Permit Services. With me is Lydia Bishop, the BPS Division Manager. And so we're here this evening to provide you with details and ask for feedback on the climate-friendly and equitable communities, or CFEC, rules related to parking reforms and electric vehicle charging capacity. Heather O'Donnell and Rob Interfeld provided an overview presentation for the full CFEC rules package back in November. And this presentation will get into the nitty-gritty details of the mandatory parking reforms and options available to the city. Here's our agenda for this evening. For context, we'll start with some background information on the city's parking rules prior to the implementation of CFEC. Next, we'll cover the mandatory changes that went into effect on January 1st, as well as the requirements for EV charging capacity that went into effect on that will go into effect on March 31st. We'll then discuss the parking reform options that are available to the city, and we'll conclude the presentation with an opportunity for questions and further discussion. Our hope is that the commission will be able to provide guidance on a preferred option following this presentation. Before going into the discussion of the new parking rules, which are designed to reduce or eliminate parking minimums, we wanted to review some of the parking rules in Eugene's current land use code. It's worth noting that the CFEC rules we'll be discussing apply to parking mandates, which are requirements to include a minimum number of off-street parking spaces with development or redevelopment. The parking reforms do not apply to on-street parking. The current code sets minimum parking requirements for all uses, which are calculated based on the use type and size of the use, as well as parking maximums for non-residential uses. There are 3 parking exempt areas identified in the code where parking is not required. The code allows reductions to the number of required parking spaces through shared parking in nodal development zones and through the adjustment review process. However, these available reductions can only reduce the required parking to 50%. Additionally, last year's middle housing ordinance removes parking requirements for middle housing developments located within 1/4 mile of MX stations and provides reductions for income qualified units and credits for on-street parking. This diagram gives an overview of the rules framework that we'll be discussing this evening. There will be a lot of information, so we've tried to color code the slides for some clarity. The rules that went into effect on the 1st of this year remove parking requirements within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors and for some other specified uses. EV charging capacity rules automatically go into effect on March 31st. The next set of rules are the parking mandates and parking regulation improvements, and they require a land use code amendment. The original deadline for these reforms was June 30th, 2023, but we applied for and received approval from the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, to extend this deadline to December 31st of 2023. Cities have some limited options for how to implement the parking reforms, and we'll be delving into those options later into the presentation. Here are the rules that became effective on January 1st, 2023. First, the city may no longer enforce parking mandates within 1/2 mile of a frequent transit corridor, which is defined as a transit line with 4 or more stops per hour at peak times. There's also a list of specific housing types and childcare uses that are now exempt from parking minimums, as well as required parking being limited to 1 space per dwelling for residential units with more than 1 unit on a lot. As you can see, the area within 1/2 mile walking distance of frequent transit corridors covers a substantial portion of the city. The details of this map can be difficult to see in a PowerPoint presentation, so Ian helped us out and printed a larger version of the map. There was also a copy of the map sent out with the pre-presentation materials if you want to look closer into the areas exempted from parking requirements. The land use team is already working with developers on projects located within this area that were previously on hold due to unfeasible parking requirements. It's worth keeping this map in mind as we go forward and discuss the available parking reform options, as no matter what option is chosen, parking mandates won't apply to lots in these areas going forward. The new EV charging rules must be effective by March 31st, 2023. The state adopted the goal that 90% of the new vehicles sold by 2035 will be EVs. To provide the infrastructure these vehicles will need, the new rules require providing charging capacity for 40% of parking spaces for some developments. As of July 2022, the building code requires charging capacity for at least 20% of parking spaces in new multi-unit buildings, as well as for new commercial buildings. However, the CFEC rules increased that requirement to 40% of parking spaces for multi-unit and mixed-use buildings, but not for commercial-only buildings. As a reminder, this is the overview of the CFAC parking rule changes. The next part of this presentation will cover the available parking reform options, which are shown in the lighter green near the bottom of this chart. These are regulations requiring a code amendment that must go into effect by December 31st, 2023. Option 1, eliminate parking mandates. The most straightforward option provided in the state rules is to remove all parking mandates throughout the city. Option 1 could be considered the most equitable because it applies equally throughout the whole city. Removing parking mandates would not do away with parking. It would instead leave it up to developers to choose how much parking to provide based on the market, lending requirements, and other demands. If the city chooses to retain parking mandates, we can choose between two approaches. However, choosing either option 2A or 2B would require additional code changes to reform our existing parking requirements. These provisions include pricing a sufficient number of on-street parking spaces, allowing developments to reduce parking mandates for solar panels or EV charging stations, and requiring that parking in multi-unit residential developments within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors be unbundled. Now, unbundling is an interesting concept, and it means that parking spaces must be rented, leased, or sold separately from the dwelling unit itself. It's worth noting that the unbundling requirement would require or would apply to existing as well as new developments. Choosing the second option, choosing the second option to reform our parking requirements provides a choice between two approaches. Option 2A is termed the fair parking policy approach. This approach requires cities to adopt at least 3 of these 5 policies. The first 2 policies include requiring unbundled parking for multi-unit, residential, and commercial developments. The other policies include requiring employers to provide a flexible commute benefit to employees who don't use the provided parking, a tax on revenue from commercial parking lots, or reducing parking mandates for multi-unit developments to no more than 1/2 space per unit. Option 2B is termed the reduced regulation parking management approach. With this approach, cities are required to adopt all 15 of these provisions. There is a lot here, but we have grouped the provisions into 3 groups. The first group is removing parking mandates, starting with parking mandates near climate-friendly areas and for transit-oriented and mixed-use developments. It also requires moving parking mandates for a variety of specific uses, including group quarters, schools, bars and taverns, studios and 1-bedroom units, for change of use permits, for redeveloping vacant buildings, for expansions of less than 30% of building footprint, for historic buildings, small businesses, and LEED certified and Oregon residential reach code developments. This option also requires setting additional parking maximums for developments near climate-friendly areas and frequent transit corridors and for other specific uses. Finally, it requires designating a parking district where on-street parking is managed through permits, payments, or time limits. So now that we know about the options available, we can cover a little bit about our public engagement strategy. With the complexity of the state's rule changes and the limited timelines for implementation of the parking rules, public engagement is a challenging aspect of this project. Fortunately, with the 6-month time extension, staff will have some ability to conduct public outreach above and beyond the public hearing process. As you can see, we're concentrating on 2 main forms of public involvement. The first is broad outreach. The second is focused engagement. Although the implementation of the public engagement strategy will take place from January to May this year, there will be many other opportunities for public comment throughout the code amendment process. This slide covers an overview of the next steps in the CFAC parking reform project. After conducting public outreach, the land use code amendments will be submitted to the DLCD in May. Then a planning commission public hearing will be held in June. Following the planning commission's recommendations, a city council public hearing will be held in October, with city council deliberations and action occurring in November, leading to an effective date of December 31st, 2023, which is required by the rules. In closing, we are seeking guidance from the Sustainability Commission on a preferred option. While the available options are limited, there can be a lot of complexity depending on the option chosen. To summarize the options again. Option 1, remove all parking mandates. No additional action is needed. Option 2A, enact 3 of 5 policies related to unbundling, employee commute benefits, implementing a tax on parking lot revenue, and limiting parking space requirements for multi-unit developments. Option 2B, enact all 15 policies removing specific parking mandates, setting parking maximums, and designating at least 1 on-street parking district. Those areas near frequent transit corridors and for certain dwelling types and childcare uses will not have required parking with any of these options. And additional code changes to reduce the burden of parking mandates are required for either of option 2. So this concludes our presentation. There is additional information available on the climate friendly rules page on the city's website and an email for parking reform questions or comments. We are now available for questions and look forward to your feedback and thoughts on the preferred option.
I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but before we go to questions, could you, you've looked into this issue a lot, could you kind of summarize to us the pros and cons, in particular, like not needing to transition away from this, car-centric culture? Because I'm not sure that's obvious. Like, where do you see the biggest climate benefits? What are the biggest barriers? Do you anticipate a lot of pushback from one and not the other? Could you generally speak to that?
I can cover a little bit about that, but yeah, I mean, what we're really hoping through this public engagement process is to get community feedback on what their reaction to the park reform options are. The guidance that we've received from a state level and then just doing research on parking requirements are that best option for equitable and for the climate concerns are removing parking mandates and then allowing for developers to unbundle parking. So that would allow people who don't have cars to rent apartments that they don't have to subsidize other people's parking costs. And that the idea be if we remove parking mandates and allow for unbundling, that people will have reason to give up their car, it'll be more affordable to live without a car. And the parking portion of this process is the first part of the project. The whole climate friendly areas will be the next portion, and they're already working on a study on the climate friendly areas. The idea is that there'll be certain areas designated in the city that have those 20-minute walkable communities where it'll be more people will be able to live without the need for having cars.
Okay, sure. I guess just at the highest level, I was curious about, it looks like according to your maps, this rulemaking applies to the entire UGB, not just the lots within the city, because of course those are not the same thing.
Well, it's specifically city lots. So it covers all lots that are annexed into the city limits within UGB, the areas that are currently in the county still. So the urbanizable land overlay zone that are inside UGB but have not been annexed yet aren't included in this package. The state rulemaking had certain population limits that would trigger the county land that's inside UGBs, and they determined that Lane County did not meet that population limit. So we're just talking about city annex properties.
So all those properties are currently not part of the analysis, and if individual properties were to start to annex into the city, would they suddenly fall under those rules for the first time?
Yes.
And are the options that were provided and shared with us developed by the state and shared with you, or developed by the city?
Yes, they're
all cities get the same option package.
Yeah, there's 8 metro areas in the state that were determined to have to comply with the parking rules, and Eugene Springfield is one of them.
So obviously, because you don't own all the streets, there's an inherent inequality there, right? Neighborhoods that have the luxury of not being in the city yet are exempt from all of these considerations. for
Yes,
now.
that is correct.
And I was curious about how no requirements for off-street parking would affect Americans with Disabilities Act and equity of access for.
So the building code will still require at least one ADA space on all developments. And this does not impact the ADA rules whatsoever. So if developments require more than that, they will still be required to have more than that. This is just for the city's own requirements to have off-street parking, depending on the development type and size of the development.
Okay, and then this is affecting new buildings?
New buildings, and then certain things like the unbundling also impacts existing developments as well.
So if all of our, I mean, we have so little buildable land, how much effect will this really have?
Well, it has to do with redevelopment as well. So right now, currently, if somebody wanted to redevelop their property, that would trigger a parking analysis. So they would look into whatever the proposed development is, and that would be the calculation based on the use type and the size of that use. And we come up with a figure about how much off-street parking has to be provided as a part of that development. And they would not get approval for those building permits unless they show that they can meet the requirements for off-street parking. And so there is a lot of redevelopment of older sites, change of uses, expansion of uses that have been stymied by needing parking when there isn't parking available. So it would open up more potential development, and then in areas that are still needing to be built, then it would be up to the developers to decide if there are market and lending requirements that would necessitate building parking.
So that explains why a developer may like this. I assume at the state level, when the legislature was considering this, there was really an analysis done of how many people would give up cars because of this, or how many, relatively, so that they could see that, I see there's a developer advantage, especially they've already said that there's no single family zoning, so you can take a lot in the hills or the, South Eugene, put up a fourplex and have no parking. I do that 3 times on a block in South Eugene. People are still going to drive because they're not near anything, but now we have 12, 15 cars on the block trying to park each night and do things like that. So I'm not sure quite what's going on here and where the analysis is. I mean, I can't give any input onto what I would recommend out of the seat of my pants or something like that, which it seems to be what people are being expected to do. Do you like that? That's cool. So you got to convince me that there's an advantage here environmentally and sustainability. I mean, somehow the legislature was convinced of this, but they probably just raised their hand anyway. So I'd like to know, are you going to be providing that information to the citizens in Eugene as they are asked to comment on this? We see that with these rules and option 2, we would expect 10% of the people to be able to give up cars, and only 30 blocks would have 40 cars on them or something like that. Information is lacking.
Yeah, it's true. And as was asked by a previous commissioner, this is a state mandate that was provided to us. The analysis they did and the reasoning they had behind this was really focused on greenhouse gas reductions. With the idea that providing less parking or providing developers with the option for less parking could help reduce our greenhouse gases. And, to be fair, it really depends on the developer, but as Reed mentioned, we do have applicants who have come in and not been able to redevelop their property because the code currently requires 25 parking spaces and they have no room on the lot for that. So the lot isn't redeveloped. So this does provide some flexibility for that. We are planning to do, as part of the public involvement strategy, a little bit more thorough code analysis to try to tease out some information about what option may be better. But, again, with seeing the 3 options, the most straightforward option, and as Reed said, probably we would consider the most equitable, would be to reduce parking mandates citywide, because people would have all the same opportunities and perhaps the same challenges.
Right, just one last comment. Yeah, and I would think on the basis of ease for development and equitability, I can understand it. In terms of greenhouse gas reduction, I'm sure Portland in that context would be different than Eugene in the context, like I'm saying, we have hills, you know, the core part of the city is covered by that half mile it's pretty flat. People could do things, but the rest of the community, you're doing that in a place where people are probably not going to be giving up vehicles, or I would have to see what percent, you know, some analysis of that to see that there's actually a greenhouse gas reduction element here from our perspective, from my perspective here. I understand all these other perspectives.
And I think from a developer's perspective, they would not be building single family homes without parking. I think that would be unlikely that, you know, like you say, the South Hills development, I think, or them to, you know, feasibility, they would realize that parking would probably be something that most people want.
And the developers we've spoken with, they have pretty strict lending requirements too. And in most multi-unit situations around the city, they are overparked. So we have parking requirements that we determine based on how many units they're proposing. And they build substantial more than that if they're in areas that aren't accessible to transit. And they make a determination based on the market that their potential renters or buyers of those units will need parking. They build it anyway.
Dennis, and then I think it was Jan. And then Liz.
Yeah, you know, as a former childcare director, that piece kind of stood out for me, no parking requirements. And I recall back in 2003-04, when we were developing Moss Street Children's Center at the university, you know, established pickup drop-off parking, as well as speed bumps around a childcare site in terms of safety. So I would hope there might be some permitting provisions required just for a safety consideration of kids getting in and out of vehicles and childcare. You know, and I don't know what the mandatory rules would allow, but I would hope the city would establish some permitting provisions for childcare kinds of uses in particular. And as I think it through, the same kinds of things when the areas around public school buildings, you know, the lineups for drop off are already pretty amazing. And if there's no possibility to park and everybody has to get in that queue, you know, it just seems to be a bottleneck kind of situations around schools and childcare facilities if there's not some kind of permitting process.
Yeah, and again, just to stress that it's not that parking cannot be provided, it's provided.
But it's not required.
But it's not required, right?
But I guess my question is, could the city, you know, do some collaborative work to establish a permitting, you know, permitted parking where, I mean, childcare family users have a permit so that they can drop off their kids in designated spots. That's what exists in front of campus childcare, for example.
So when you say permitted, do you mean on the street?
If that's all that's potentially available.
I mean, that's certainly.
I mean, there are 20-minute zones where, you know, pickup and drop off only. That may be one permit basis. You know, limited duration parking so that there's potential for pickup, drop off.
I mean, I think it is possible, but you know, it's not something that I would be able to speak to because it's not part of this process.
Yeah.
And some of that would be, you know, a different department if it was on-street parking.
Well, when I hope that looking forward for that kind of development, those kinds of provisions of pedestrian safety will be considerations that are looked at in the bigger process. You know, and like childcare and schools are the ones that immediately come to mind, but there may be other issues where pedestrian safety is a consideration. YMCA, other recreational facilities near parks, etc.
Because I was going to say some similar things to Art and Nielsen in a little bit different way, but I just think that it's hard for me to visualize the impacts of this, especially if the two options, I mean, really all of them. So I think it's hard for us, it's gonna be hard for the general public to respond to information. Most people like to look out. So I wonder if you have amongst the staff or intend to address this a little bit, to say, here's what we think might happen, and say, this is required, this is not required. Developers can still provide spaces, but based on our experience, here's what we anticipate might happen. Here are things where it might go smoothly because they're going to want to provide this. Here are places where it might not go so smoothly because this. There are some places where there might be safety issues. Here are some places where it's going to probably be a real improvement. It needs some elaboration. You all have the experience to provide.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that the parking portion of the CFAC rule changes is the first part to take effect. Also part of it, which the overview presentation happened back in November, is a transportation planning update. So that portion of it is reassessing how our transportation network and system and planning functions. And that would be where figuring out those safety issues, if we're seeing that so much parking is going away, that safety issues are popping up, they would be able to change that going forward in the transportation plan.
I guess first, just kind of reiterating, that's quite a challenge if the window is January to May, we're in January. And I think it's kind of a fire hose for us. I mean, some of you are like, yes, no problem, we do this all the time, but I don't even know how you break it down into the bites that you could put into a commercial that people go, oh, I understand all the intricacies. So that would be of interest. And I have just a question on our efforts on the equitable side, especially with the unbundling, where the goal there is to, at least my understanding is the goal there would be to basically be pushing the cost of having what I'd call a safe parking space onto only individuals that have cars, so that people that don't have cars aren't, you said, sharing the cost in that. You just have concern if an unintended consequence of that could be somebody could still be struggling financially, but they have to have a car to meet their job's requirements because it requires travel. And so then the cost for them to be able to park keeps going up and up and up, just from the supply and demand side of things. So that would be a concern that I would have, that could be an unintended consequence. Because I think my hunch is the thought process is, oh, well, that way the people that want to have a car can afford to, so they can pay more. But really people that have to have a car, but they can't afford for that parking space to go up astronomically.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right, and that's a concern, and unbundling is certainly one of the things that is pretty complicated, and as Reed said, would apply to existing developments. So I'm not even sure how we would go in and tell somebody, okay, you have to, and what is the mechanism to unbundle parking from an existing structure? Are they gonna just increase their rent and say, well, if you want a parking space, you have to pay X amount more? And also we recognize, and frankly, we've been scrambling because, the state has given us quite a challenge here in terms of trying to, they want us to go to, out to the public and to get feedback on this. But prior to our timeline extension, we would have had to have this all adopted and in effect by the end of June, which means that it would have to be adopted in May, right? So there, I'm glad we have the additional 6 months, but it does not give us a lot of time. So, the drinking from a fire hose, or the fire hose analogy that you mentioned, is something very nice.
Speak a little more to the unbundling, which is, it's a very tricky thing to wrap our heads around. And speaking with developers, some developers already do provide unbundled parking, where it's basically, they call it rodeo parking, where it's like they just leave it up to people if they want to buy parking and then use those spaces, or they can just leave it up to parking for free for all. So And when we talk to developers, they do a market analysis when they are building new multi-units, and they look into whether they're providing free parking compared to nearby units that do provide parking. And if they don't provide parking, then they will typically charge less as far as the market analysis. Now, that's not to say that on an individual level, some apartment complexes might keep the same price and then all of a sudden charge extra for the parking. However, the research and the studies that have been done on the matter do show that overall costs do go down when you unbundle parking. And that's, I think, the main reason why the state included that is part of the other options. If we do decide to retain parking, it's a way to still get at some of the issues that are seen with requiring parking.
Is that unbundling analysis then? Obviously, it wasn't done here. So was that done like Portland or a city that's maybe more robust?
Yeah, there's one book that does a study on it. I think they covered some areas around San Francisco, LA, outside of Seattle. Yeah, it's typically going to be bigger metropolitan areas that have had these studies done. I know St. Paul, Minnesota removed their parking mandates. I think it was 2 years ago at this point. And their studies have shown that the parking levels that have been provided by developments have retained the same level, even though they aren't requiring parking anymore.
I had two things. One, thinking about going to the public, maybe presenting like 3 case studies and like not saying who's you alluded to like these developers have come in and couldn't do projects, but with this they could, and maybe just creating a couple of really simple case studies and saying this is based on a real example that happened in Eugene in this neighborhood. This is what they wanted, this is why they couldn't. If they did it, this is what it would look like. I think that would make it a lot more clear.
We are tracking those. They're kind of in process right now because these just went into effect at the first of the year. But yeah, there's a couple of potential developments that we're not willing or we can't talk about at this point because it's still conceptual, but they have come in and they weren't going to be able to build what they wanted to feasibly with the previous parking requirements, but they've now that they don't have to provide as much parking, scale back the parking slightly, and it looks like the projects are feasible now. Some affordable housing projects.
My question is about the EV charging requirements. Is that 40%? Were any of the options going to give more EV charging or less, depending on what the city picked?
That one just kicks in mandatory at the end of March, and it's just 40% of parking spaces that are provided in any multi-unit or mixed use development. So mixed uses, multi-unit combined with commercial uses, and any parking spaces that they choose to provide, 40% of those would have to have the charging capacity. But again, it's like, it really depends on if we require them to provide the spaces or if they choose to. It'll depend on how much parking that they provide.
So the EV charging percent doesn't change on any of these scenarios.
Yeah, quite to that, but I just want a quick question since you brought that up. Is that on existing development as well, the 40%?
That's new development.
Devin, then Mitra.
I just wanted to comment first on what you said about the cost, as far as I just have a hard time. I know you said these analysis, but in San Francisco, Minneapolis, and LA all have incredibly expensive cost of living. And I just, to your point as well, like I would like to see some actual analysis here. I have a hard time if market forces are at play, that you just don't end up here with parking just being more expensive in your apartment, also being more expensive for your whatever, your condo, whatever it is. I was just wanting to say that I think it's unrealistic to think that apartment costs and housing costs would go down. And to Art's point, in Southeast, not necessarily where I live, but this was a huge concern for our neighborhood association, and we went through the HB 2001 code amendments with like a fine tooth comb, trying to explain them to our neighbors, really trying to do outreach because we weren't getting outreach. And it was affecting it. There's a very specific part of the neighborhood in the flats that is very susceptible to this kind of parking situation. I know that's a huge concern for all those residents in that area, is that if somebody builds a fourplex with no parking requirement, what does the street look like? And is it safe for children? How many cars can actually be parked on the street in that area? Again, it's not where I live, but I talked with a lot of people in our area that are very concerned about that particular effect of no parking requirement.
And it's tricky because regardless of what option we choose, that map there, we won't be able to provide or require parking on any of those lots going forward, no matter what option we choose. So it's one of those mandatory changes that the state has just pushed us into this box. So we have to figure out amongst the three options we have, which one is the best for our city going forward.
So I guess my point is more the outreach piece is gonna be incredibly important for those people. I mean, other people as well, but I know that somehow there has to be some kind of intense outreach on these things. In the short amount of time.
Chair and then Councilor Semple and then Lisa.
I was just wondering if, so the unbundling is just option 2B, correct?
Well, both option twos require some unbundling. I believe it's.
Yeah, could you go back up to the summary slide? Okay.
This one requires both. So parking for multifamily residential units near transit must be unbundled regardless of which second option we choose. And then 2A specifically is the one that also requires, if we were to choose either one or two, because you have to choose 3 of these 5 provisions, 1 and 2 both relate to unbundled parking. One is related to unbundling residential unit developments all throughout the city, except for townhouses, and the other is for commercial developments. So that is kind of like the ultra unbundling if we choose those 2 options.
And then so with option 1, it's just no parking requirements at all. And I guess, I think what I'm hearing everyone say is the effects or consequences or potential like impact of these is what people are most interested in. And I'm just getting a little confused about the difference in impact between unbundling versus removing all requirements. Like to get all together. I understand from a development like point of view. And I just wanted to say something about what you were talking about, Dennis, about the childcare. To think about that childcare facilities are very in demand and we need more of them right now. And if we do remove restrictions for parking, that might make more of them be enabled to come about in smaller and various versions. That's another side of that. Of course, I'm concerned about safety and whatnot as well, but I think that's not in the planning department, probably more in a, well, I don't know.
Well, and like Reed said, that could be part of the transportation system plan update that is being done
And
subsequently.
that's to come after this process.
And the state, I don't know how they could have made it more complicated for us. And originally they said all of this, and we, honestly, it's taken a long time for us to even try to wrap our heads around. So I appreciate the idea of, some case studies and the feedback that you're giving us around trying to talk to the public about this, because it's very complex. And we are going to have to figure out how to, it's difficult because, and especially with the Sustainability Commission, we want to give you all of the information about what's being required. But it's a lot.
And speaking with the TLCD, they had initially just wanted to do remove all parking mandates. It was going to initially be just option 1 that was mandated on all cities. With pushback from cities through the rulemaking process, they decided to institute these other 2 options. Option 2A with the unbundling, they included that because they feel strongly that pushing towards unbundling would provide a benefit and would bring down the cost of housing. And then option 2B was more of what they call an option 1 light, because it still removes a lot of the parking mandates for different uses or different development types, but it doesn't, it retains the ability to have some parking mandates, although we still would have our hands tied quite a bit if we go with that option.
Thank you. Heard a little bit about this before, but I didn't have some handouts. Can you put that PowerPoint online? On your site, maybe just think about it. I found it very useful and easier to understand than
Yeah, that's a great
our
idea.
handout. And since you've already made it, it could be easy. One thing I'd like to emphasize is this came from the state. there's not a lot of choices that we have in here. So when you look at this stuff and you go, oh, that's gonna be awful. The answer is, oh, it's gonna be awful. And we don't have an ability to rewrite the options. They came to us with a very short timeline and no money. No provisions for us to hire staff to do this. So we have to do it with present staff from our planning department, which are already smashed with really critical projects. So this was not happy news for anybody. I don't know who's jumping up and down about it, but it's not us. It's kind of scary how fast it all has to happen, how complicated the information is. And that we really don't have that many choices. One question about option one, if we repealed everything and it didn't work, could we then later go put in some of these options instead? Or is it forever? You can never have a parking thing again.
We can choose to change our approach down the line if we do choose so. If we don't take any action and pass the code amendments, then we get one automatically. But if we pass one, then we can reassess and choose one of the other options down the line. Additionally, if we choose option one, we can also look into some of these motivational policies down the line as well as a part of the transportation plan. And there's also a land use planning update that's a part of that transportation planning update as well. So there will be the potential to kind of reassess where we're at and figure out alternative solutions to any situations that might arise.
It's better to take one than have it forced and then no changes later. Two parts of this are, it's a double thing. It's kind of like Councilor Zelenka's proposal for a levy to do climate and housing, homeless situations. And so we've got this equity problem, we've got a climate problem, we've got a housing problem. So the thought was, quick, how can we make some big differences, make everyone miserable? But that's what the point of this is. So part of it, yes, is can we get less cars on the road? Can we have more electric plugs, both of which are desirable things? Can we do it without negatively impacting people who don't have finances? And how much will it actually get us more housing, which frankly is really, really critical. So, maybe we want to extend our bus routes to the places that don't have a lot of parking and encourage mass transit. So my personal thinking right now is option one, pass it, change it later. Staff can keep going on things. And it doesn't mandate unbundling. If later we want unbundling, we can do it. But these separate things aren't forced on us. And I think a lot of childcare places would put like a driveway in, we hope. But anyway, they're not going to mandate it at all. So we need to think of something creative for those things. That was all the bad news I had to talk about.
And for what it's worth, I think Reed has kept an eye on what other places are doing. And most people are going with option one. I just think because of the complexity and, like this one here, which requires that we tax revenue from a commercial parking lot. I mean, we're the building and permit services department. And like you say, the planners, we don't do that. It's really complicated.
You had to hire and set up
Something
things for the payroll tax, how
Oh,
do
right.
new taxes? It's not as easy as saying, put one here. I'm really looking for that. Nobody likes this. I think maybe they made it so complicated, so we go, okay, option one. But I encourage everyone to talk about it, think about it to the best of what you can figure out. And use us as resources. Great presentation for a really crazy complicated subject.
Yeah, so I would really first, I would encourage trying to simplify the language. I know it's important to keep code language sounding like code for specificity, but nobody will understand what you're talking about. If you're taking this out to the community and to tag on what Laura said, taking a case study and then, or making a visual, you know, an example of that meets these different things. It could be hypothetical, but to kind of explain what this would be. I really feel strongly that commercial developments that unbundled parking would just simply raise prices and not lower prices for folks who don't get a parking spot. And that doesn't mean that folks will have a car. It means they'll park on the street. And we have examples of this in River Road, where the street is owned by the city, or I'm sorry, by the county. There's no parking enforcement and there's not enough parking for that building. And so the surrounding 6 blocks are slammed full of cars, which increases vandalism and danger. And there's not even curb and gutter, so it's parking in people's front yards. So from an equity standpoint, there's a huge difference between Santa Clara and student district. I mean, like the city is so different that, you know, discouraging students from bringing cars to school is, I mean, it's not, you know, is there something that the university, are there partners here that can help to meet the goal of what we're actually trying to get out of this in terms of who brings cars and uses cars that might not need them as much. Student population is concentrated and dense, and it's often, you know, sort of a luxury item. Folks who need a car to get to work and can't work without it, having their costs raised is not fair. Option 1, if it is allowed to then be reviewed later, of course, this is only redevelopment and this is only new buildings. And there's not a lot of, I mean, there's probably some redevelopment happening, but most of our housing stock is already there and not going anywhere. So given this exclusion and the fact that we've already got a lot of buildings, it's hard, it sounds really big and scary, but I still can't see what actual impact it would have. And at the same time, by saying, oh, and we're going to incentivize all this EV charging, we're not actually reducing the number of cars, we're just favoring rich people cars, which sucks. I'm all for electric vehicles, but most people won't be able to afford them for a long time. So I find this whole thing really sad and stressful, and I can feel for your team to do with that. Is there any provision of either option 2s that you feel like is inspired or thoughtful? That you would, that if you could just pick one of those things that you would do?
The only real reason is just the difficulty of unbundling when related to multi-unit and commercial would push us towards option 2B, even though that's not an easy solution either.
Can you put that one up?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2B is essentially adding additional uses that don't have parking mandates. So it's a little bit simpler from that standpoint. Is that what your question was? If we were looking at 2A or 2B?
I guess so, or, you know, I mean, we already have a district where on-street parking is managed through payments and time limits. That system is currently unfunded and doesn't function very well because I know that during the pandemic, the parking services team was, you know, so does any of this refund that system? Are we planning to expand that system further into the neighborhood?
You mean the
Parking services,
university?
paid parking, on-street parking.
Right.
And so part of either, if we choose option 2, requires us to do a study of our priced on-street parking.
Yeah.
And we have to meet certain standards by 2023 and then increase, I think it's 10% by 2025. So we'll have to study where we do charge for on-street parking and make sure that we meet the state requirements, and that there's reporting requirements as well for that. So yeah, if we choose either option 2, that's something that would have to be a part of that package as well.
Which is probably increasing the price of our existing
On-street parking.
Yeah.
To fund it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've already, certain areas that do residential permits would have to go up in price to get to what we need to get to if we choose those options.
I'm not sure that's order right.
I goes
Jan. We have 10 more minutes for this.
I'll be really quick. Councilor Semple said one thing that I was gonna say. I think that when you go to the public, that framing is really important. That I don't, you know, I'm afraid the city's gonna get hammered for this. because you'll be the ones, providing the message. And people are gonna be worried and concerned about how it's gonna affect them in so many different ways. So I think in emphasizing that it is a state mandate, but also why the state is doing this, what the goals are, what the hopeful positive benefits are, why it's important. Starting everything with that. Providing.
Way is interesting because you choose 3 out of the 5. So there's 10 different combinations of things. So you could go through all those and say, well, suppose it was 1, 2, and 3, or suppose it was 1, so I mean, that's a very complex thing to analyze, given there's hardly any analysis done at all, other than it could maybe improve housing. It could maybe, it's all a could kind of wishful thinking about all of these. So I hear Council Semper saying, well, maybe we can at least pass number 1 and get on with life, because there's no reason to believe any combination of those is going to do what you maybe would hope it would do, really. And you don't have time to do the analysis. But I think when you do present, like, a few examples have come out from you, from your experience, and also generally some pros and cons. I think you just can't throw that out at people and say, give us your opinion. You did to us. That was too weird. I mean, so you need to at least have some information about pros and cons about that. We know from development that would spur certain kinds of development. We know certain things you have a sense that it might do. Other things are a little foggy, or one can see the intention there. But I think that's important. Otherwise, you can't possibly respond to that. Of course, you'd be accused then of leading people into choosing what you want to do.
Right.
But I mean, we have to somehow trust you to have some expertise, or somebody better have some expertise, or the state better be providing some
Well, and
analysis.
we've asked for some of this
Right,
information.
so there's got to be some reality fact thing that can go along with this to help guide people's input.
And just a quick one, and a reminder to all that it wasn't a legislative mandate, it was an executive order that established the rules. And you commented that cities pushed back and got some extensions and more flexibility in the rules. Are there any provisions and discussions within the city about legislative action that might set up some different kinds of standards rather than these existing executive orders? Because that's how it came into being.
What do you mean by setting up? You mean?
Our cities discussing their intergovernmental affairs might be wanting to look at legislative remedies to some of the parts of this that are deemed over-regulation. To use a language I don't often use.
Some cities have chosen, there's a lawsuit currently with regards to this.
So there's litigation.
There is, and that Eugene is not a part of that, Springfield is. But, again, because of the timelines, it could be something that we do. Because that's again, in a different department, but.
Right, that's governmental affairs in consultation with council.
Keep moving forward in order to meet the deadline.
Right, and that may be another argument for just doing the simplest version and then explore other options that may be available legislatively or otherwise down the road.
Anecdotally, Springfield is one of the cities that is a part of that lawsuit challenging the rulemaking, but they are also going with option 1 as well.
I'll try to be brief. In response to Councilor Semple's comment about bus routes expanding. And what you brought to my attention is so valid, is that map is transitory, right? I mean, we've almost lost our Amazon bus route number 28 several times. So what does that map look like when LTD reduces a bus line? I mean, or expands a bus line. It's not fixed in time. For sure, to keep that in mind. So it's kind of the half-mile stuff, like a little bit. I don't see more buses coming our way either, really. Funding is not part of this.
When we asked LTD for guidance on which bus lines met the frequent transit corridor definition, they showed that there was, this is where they have now, but there was one proposed expansion out Coburg Road. That's one of the areas that not grayed out on the map, and that was the only thing they said that they did have planned expansion out there, but didn't give us any indication of what it might look like in the future, which does provide additional challenges too, because as that changes, like the map, if we go with the option, that's going to be in the code, that map, and then we'll have to figure out how to write a code to reassess when it does change down the line, which provides additional challenges for code writing.
If we don't do option
Yeah,
one.
we don't do option.
Right, right. One other question. So all parking mandates include parking maximums. So you currently have parking maximums to prevent, I don't know, I'm trying to think of absurd, obscene uses of open space for parking. Is that? Yes, big box stores, big box stores. You know, places where there's antiquated parking lots that are never full. How would that be affected, or is there consideration for redevelopment of parking lots to?
There is a provision that we didn't get into because it's not one of the options that are available here. We're trying to streamline this
Yeah.
presentation, but regardless of what option we go forward with, any parking lot, that new parking lot that's proposed that's over a quarter acre in size has a requirement for 50% of tree canopy or solar panels and also pedestrian amenities. So there will be looking into maximums and trying to make sure that we don't have those big expanses.
Okay, thank you.
So I think we are. Thank you both so much for coming.
Or just time.
Yeah, time.
Well, thank you very much for the feedback. We really appreciate it.
My sympathy.
Yeah, good luck to you. Thank you.
Appreciate this.
Before we go to our next topic, I was just reading the study and that was looking at EV costs nationwide, and it found that 90% of people would actually save money by having an EV versus a gas car. So,
Over time. That's just the upfront cost.
yeah, but just
Everybody has that.
yeah, there's a lot of we see in other options too. So we're gonna move into our next item, which I think is Louisa with commission draft letters pending the public overlay zone. You want to take that one?
Sure. So in our November meeting, which feels like a million years ago, we had a presentation from Zach Mulholland and Beyond Toxis and learned about the public health overlay zone concept to redress the co-locating of heavy industry with residential, specifically around West Eugene. And he shared the concept of a publicly overlay zone as it has been modeled in Clear Lake and other areas where it prohibits certain uses, industry, and would the kind of one concept in addition would be to upzone properties that are currently zoned residential adjacent to industrial to commercial zoning to kind of create a larger buffer between homes and industry. So there were several topics that came up. I think that the commission overarchingly supported all those concepts. And so we received a draft letter of support from Zach, and we basically rewrote it to focus on the things that we as a group thought were important. And we were, I guess the ask is to review the letter and put forward a motion to send this on to council.
Yeah. Great letter. Anyone have questions about the letter or see any word choices, changes, or anything that got left out or that you want taken out?
I don't know, the one sentence about our community has grown and our residents do not believe that locating known toxic industries within city limits is acceptable. I don't know. We know that. I mean, clearly there's a group that's definitely opposed to that and one would hope that that's probably the way people think, but I don't know that we have done some survey or anything like that. Tells us that clearly there's big support for this.
I mean, I think we were taking that from the door-to-door conversations that Beyond Toxics had with residents in West Eugene, specifically around the health impacts that they personally experience.
Right, so I definitely.
I guess we could say some residents,
Or many.
many residents, a plurality of residents. You
I don't
know,
know, it's fine, but it seemed to be not necessary to say.
That struck me too, is like, do we really know this? So if we could just make that less universal, since we don't, there was
Okay.
we don't have like hard facts behind it, though, I would
What does
assume.
it have to do with the fact that the community has grown? Because this would be important even if the community had stayed the same.
I think the thinking was, a lot of the industries predate the neighborhoods. And so where industry and also just the general awareness about the impacts of toxics on human health were not known when those industries were built and were not considered when the residential neighborhoods were built around them.
I know.
Some, we could say many, we could say,
But our residential community has grown, seems to be the important thing to me, because now we have more people sleeping next to
right,
the smoke.
so we could just say residents.
Oh, well, you say, as our residential community has grown, our residents believe that, I think I should just say many still, but yeah.
Ian, are you comfortable doing that little wordsmithing on the spot? Yeah.
I don't know what it does.
You don't need it.
Yeah.
Council to see that sentence.
I will tell you, it's embarrassing, but there's a long letter for council to actually read. Is that not sad? But the first one, at least, separate that into 2 paragraphs. People don't read long paragraphs anymore, but a lot of paragraphs, if you look, they're now a sentence long. It's crazy.
So
Where's the topic
I would
sentence?
split it at the recommended strategy for public
Right.
health buffer zone,
Very good.
effectively creates buffer zones between homes and specific industrial uses.
So the city council doesn't,
So if they only read the first sentence to be fair, I'm sorry.
oh, no, you're good. I'd say so the council would not approve of James Fenimore Cooper's writing then. The council will not approve of James Fenimore Cooper's writing then if they don't like long paragraphs.
Well, no, it doesn't mean we don't approve of other writings or that we don't even read all our email. I'm just telling you that
Maybe just
Get
take out
more
the
of
hour
your
before
point.
residents.
if it's smaller and more succinct, I'm trying to help you.
That's why I don't think we need that sentence.
Take out the sentence.
Hmm.
If nobody-
I think it doesn't do anything. It's true, maybe it's helpful, but I don't think it reads well without the sentence there.
I think the
It's more
point
to
is
the
that we
point.
have an outraged populace, you know, that
Wow.
there's more people and so there's more outrage and we're trying to say, hey, council, we're outraged.
More interaction between residential and industrial sites. It's kind of what we're trying to say.
Get to the point, bullet point, we are outraged.
Right.
I don't care either way, but
Move it.
they have anybody, you have to. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. So there's a sentence that we can either spend a little bit of time wordsmithing or we can just take it out because it. Does anyone feel strongly either way?
We can just take it out.
Okay, let's take it out. That is
Yeah.
simple.
Okay, I have one question, which is specifically to Counselor Semple around the overlay zone opportunity and the benefit it might have to strengthening vibration rules, specifically around the particular facility that has been impacting residents of Train Song and River Road.
There's a motion coming to
345.
council shortly.
Okay, so
from
that's
our
already
new
being-
Counselor Leach,
Okay,
to pass that without the waiting period.
okay,
So, yes, it should be, also covered by this,
okay,
but, we have something else coming first.
thank you kindly. Okay, is there a motion to approve the letter?
So we need to approve it with removal of that sentence.
And the paragraph.
Oh, and the second, and.
As amended.
As amended.
As shown.
Okay, all in favor of this letter as amended? Anyone opposed? Stand aside? No, great. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna do updates from staff. now. Do you want commissioners to go first? Ian, or your- Okay, updates from commissioners. I have one from our, we had one meeting with the education and outreach group. Brian gave a presentation. And we made a brainstorm of ways moving forward, but we haven't chosen any one way or another. There was, yeah, we had a bunch of ideas. And I plan to reconvene. Are people in the group still interested in reconvening? You put your little things up. Everyone is- Okay, great. So we'll reconvene and. Anyone want to say more to it? Want to ask questions about that?
Under updates from commissioners, can we otherwise do questions?
Sure.
I wanted to hear, and I was, that's why. What the update is about the outreach and engagement in particular. I heard about some sustainability workshops or something that's happening at Campbell Center. I don't know if we're involved, the city's involved in it or someone else putting those on, or, and we had talked about. So I just.
We'll just see if there are any other commissioner updates, because you're next. I didn't see anyone.
So to your question directly, I'm not aware of that, so I will look into that. There is mostly tied to the electrification decarbonization study. There will be outreach that's going to be ongoing this year. There's currently outreach that's ongoing with regard to climate friendly areas and the climate friendly rules that's going on. So there's a lot of different outreach that's ongoing right now or going to be starting soon. For the specific thing you asked about, I might follow up with you because I did not hear about that. I was not familiar
Yeah,
with that.
and I was looking and I couldn't find a Campbell Center calendar on mine easily today, so. But yeah, sure.
So not a lot of updates, but just to and I'm taking Councilor Semple's, thunder away.
No,
trying to-
please go. I'm depending on you. I realized I forgot my tentative agenda. I don't know what we're doing.
So just some upcoming work sessions that I thought the commission would be interested in. So next Monday, there's going to be a work session on Parks and Recreation funding, and that's a follow-up on a work session that was about a week ago. Just talking about a levy and some things on figuring out how to fund some of the work in the parks within the city. Downtown urban renewal will be on next Wednesday. That's a new time one, but that's another work session with council. And then urban reserves is about a month from now. That's kind of urban growth boundary related. And that's going to be, again, another new work session, but those are three work sessions that I thought might be of interest for the commission. There's going to be, I don't know where it is now, it's in a week or so, where council is going to be taking a vote on the noise ordinance.
Yeah, it's coming right up. And that's what I'm saying. Councilor Leach put out a motion for us to vote on it. I could pull it up, but her motion would make it be effective immediately. Usually it has 30-day window to come into effect.
For those, I think most people know, but UWeb put out their IRP back in December, their draft, and they've been doing some outreach on that. There's going to be two things on there. One, Frank is the general manager. He's going to be speaking. I wrote this down to make sure I knew it. On this Friday at noon at the inn, talking about the IRP, and then they're having a town hall on February 21st at 5:30, where they're going to be soliciting input on the IRP from the general public. And they're looking at like a 4 or 6 month public engagement process for that as they work to finalizing the IRP.
You
for that.
define RP for.
Sorry, it's the integrated resources plan. It's kind of their supply planning over the next 20 or 25 years. What was interesting, and some folks from the city got briefed by eWeb a couple weeks ago, is they're trying to do it more frequently now. Instead of doing it every couple of years, they're looking to actually do it every year as a way to kind of have a rolling. They're starting to see the current bondable power contract expires in 2028. And so they're starting to figure out sort of what is the supply going to look like, can bondable power provide some of their supply? So really trying to revisit this on a more frequent basis to get a better handle on demand. They're seeing, the onset of electrification having a pretty big impact on some of their demand over the next, 7 to 10 years, and trying to figure out how they can meet that demand through their current infrastructure. So it's not a reliability study. It's really a supply study where they're getting their resources from. But it's really interesting how they're looking at both supply, but also demand side things, and looking at conservation and demand response and batteries and some other things as a way to sort of level some of their demand and meet some of the increasing demand, some brought by EVs and other things that they're seeing coming up out of the grid, and how they're going to sort of meet some of that over the next 7 to 10 years for that. Quickly on a staffing update, it's been a very long process, which is my fault, but we have panel interviews for the climate analyst, and they're going to be occurring next week. We have 5 candidates that we're going to be interviewing. And I think we have a really good panel, and looking forward to doing that and having a good conversation with these candidates. And hopefully there will be a climate analyst on board soon on the heels of that. And then just very quickly on some of the upcoming future topic areas that we're talking about. So for next month, the thinking was to have Lane County come out and talk about some of their MRF and the RFP that they put out for materials recovery facility and some of the digester bioenergy work that they're looking at, to talk about where they are in their process, what they're thinking about, how it's going to help them meet state goals, how it's going to help sort of manage some of the waste within the county, and have greenhouse gas emission impacts as well. So to have them kind of talk through where they are, what their thinking is, and kind of what the lay of the land is for that. And I thought that would be really interesting, given all the waste work that's been done in this committee, with this commission in the past. And then in 2 months, the Public Works is going to come and talk and get some feedback on the street design standards that are tied to the street bonds. And so there's going to be 2 things tied to the street bond that Public Works is going to want to come to the commission on. One is this, which is streets, and then obviously street trees is a big one as well, where the commission's going to have a really big impact on figuring out how to roll some of that program out. And I'm working and talking to staff to figure out how we're going to come to the commission on that as well. But those are 2 things that we're looking at over the next few months to come to the commission for some of your feedback and input on some of that work.
I had 2 real quick follow-up questions. One was, does the UAB presentation or this propping you've gotten talk about the net metering impacts or time of day pricing? Has that been part of that?
Talked about a little bit of that
demand side?
and yeah, time of use and doing some great things.
Okay,
Yes,
so that might be part of that conversation.
Yeah.
That's great. And then the other was just for the rest of the commission, the county obviously owns Short Mountain, which is where all of our trash goes. And we've had really calamitous impacts from the recycling system falling apart across the west coast of the US. And so the county is considering, I don't work for the county, this is just what I generally know, considering basically opening their own recycling facility to stabilize that. So that would be part of that presentation, to gather regional materials, and then we would have not only our recycling dealt with, but also primary materials coming out the other side that can be used for new products.
Can I ask you a quick question about that briefly?
I may not know the answer, but that's okay.
Is there any kind of like improvement in composting associated with that?
Do you mean the removal of single, like, so
No, like improving, like as part of opening a whole new facility, would there be, or I mean, there should be, but part like an expanded ability for composting of kitchen trash that's picked up, I mean, not, you know what I'm saying? Food scraps, all that kind of stuff, like compared to say Portland, where you can put your pizza box in the compost and they allow compostable bags and they have a whole next level composting.
yeah.
Compared to Eugene or Lane County.
We do that. We have
Well,
not waste.
No, you
So the
do.
challenge was that the city mandated compostable single-use items. And then the composting system was so overwhelmed by paper products or these polymers, these biopolymers, that it created a system that wasn't actually effectively making compost anymore. And it was also very difficult to keep that system clean. There's a challenge with certifying organic materials with GMO cornstarch, plastic forks. And so there was a challenge in there. And I think it was Rexius had the city contract for picking up compost out of your yard waste bin. So that's now, you can put food scraps in your yard waste bin. So we now have a curbside system for the first time. And but the disconnect still very much exists. And I don't know that we have the volume that Portland does to even out the kind of non-food compostables and the food compostables.
That was my impression, that the
Yeah.
main issue was volume, but I haven't been able to get anybody to really answer that.
Yeah, and I'm
definitively.
curious how if Metro Eugene plus Springfield or unincorporated county was somehow combined, like, that's a great question, I don't know.
And I think the county is looking at that. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but I think part of this was looking at mixed waste management and the anaerobic digester that's part of this RFP that they put out and as a mechanism to help deal with larger volumes of this. But I think, you know, from the county, they would definitely be able to speak to that a lot more in a lot more
That'd be
detail
great.
next month on that.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
goal was to kind of talk through their thinking, cost structures, kind of, you know, timelines and things like that.
Excellent.
Just a comment on that, what you were saying about the compost system here. I took the master recyclers class recently that the county puts on, and that they cover a lot of that. We got to tour Rexius, and from my understanding, it was about the cleanliness of, like, during COVID, with all the to-go food, like, and the confusion and unregulated like how to discern what is a biodegradable food thing from a non-biodegradable, and just contaminating it was the main thing that was happening. But potentially the volume thing could be addressed and potentially expanded to our local or area communities that are smaller that don't have that service if it does come to that, which I'd be curious to ask them, but that's very exciting. I just knew a little bit.
Super exciting, lots of questions about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to learn, and just the COVID impacts on single use serving has to be addressed very strategically, because otherwise it seems easier now to just keep going with that unless we deliberately and intentionally combat it. I have a very anecdotally good friend who works in the kitchen services for 4J, and every single kid gets a disposable fork twice a day, every day across the school system. And it's heartbreaking what the amount of volume of single-use trash we've pivoted to because of COVID.
Not only that, but the workforce challenges in the industry, the food and beverage industry is also contributing to that, just because I've seen, not necessarily here in Eugene, but on the coast, restaurants just eliminate job positions and use.
Oh,
Yeah. So it's really,
everything is
really hard to see for me. Yeah.
future conversations, but maybe we'll be inspired to take on some of that ongoing waste challenge once the presentation.
I think those are all my updates.
Counselor Simple, it's you. Didn't we talk, this is just for my memory, weren't you kind of go at the beginning of the meeting? Did we decide that? And then we forgot.
If I have some really important thing I have to go do, I'll just say, I gotta go first. But this is where I've traditionally been, which in the beginning, when I didn't, it was brand new and I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to say, and I forget my tentative agenda, and I would be like, oh, good, I have the whole meeting, I figure out what to say. So I love it, Ian helps me out a ton. Really only two things that come to my mind is we had the public hearing yesterday about building height limitations over by Skinner's Butte. Brian Obie has plans to build a 7-story apartment building, market rate, not low income housing. And the difference in height would allow 100 more units. So, we need housing, we need to be able to see the butte. So that's a dilemma. Not a ton of people came to the public hearing. There were 3 for it, Chamber, Brian Obie, and gosh, I can't remember the third one. Oh, the builders, Better Homes Together, Better House, whatever. Those 3 were for it. And then, probably 10 were against it for a variety of reasons. It was interesting to me, there were 2 people from Yapua who were against it. Don't put in a big apartment building by the pews. Go figure. So we're gonna have a vote on that on the 13th of February. Public record is closed, but that doesn't mean you can't keep writing as individual. There's probably a forum before then too. And then at some point, we're gonna vote on electrification for low-rise residential buildings. I think we have discussed it to death and should go ahead and vote, but I'm not really sure where that's coming up, the mayor and the manager decide the agenda. So it's still live. And I have a heat up coat that's awesome. My daughter found for me a couple of years ago. I freeze. There's this little button here. I want you to know it is not fossil fuel. And thank you for all your work. It's a pleasure to be part of this commission.
Thank you, Counselor. I know it's been a difficult time in COVID-related issues and, homeless issues and the heat you folks took around middle housing as well as lots and lots of discussion about electrification. And you had people who wanted to serve on the council in the midst of all of this. Who knew, right?
Yeah. It's been pretty wild. Certainly COVID made a big impact. It's made it more difficult to do my work because I don't see the counselors in person. I see them more now, but staff, people working at home. And there's a lot of communication that goes on in the hallway or before and after meetings. And when you're on Zoom, we're adjourned, it's gone. There's no, hey, what did you think about her? Wasn't she, off the wall or, are you gonna vote next time? I've only talked to 2 people. So it's been a lot of information that I've missed during the pandemonium days. So it's really rejuvenating to get to meet with all of you in person. Thank you. And we are filling up this room better than council did today, so thanks for all attending.
Right, or closing, do you have anything? Closing the next step?
Unless there are other questions, I don't think so at this point.
Okay. Great, we're adjourned.
Good meeting, thank you. And my apologies for my faulty only.